My favourite parts of both Library of Ruiner and Limbus Company are the duels, specifically fixer duels. But, although Library of Ruiner and Limbus Company have interesting combat systems, it simply doesn't scratch that itch I felt whenever I think about what else could be. So I decided. I'd put together rules for a text-based role-playing game that would encompass all the things I find interesting about fixers, and then host this game for others to play. So let's begin by going through what I feel are necessary for any fixer-style game. First of all, obviously, the most important aspect of fixers are the fighting, so a combat system is immediately necessary for this game. It needs to be fast-paced and enjoyable, while still being able to scale it up into a larger game for reasons I'll get into later. Feeding back into combat, there needs to be a way to augment your fixer, either through weaponry and armor that are a staple of any good fixer, or the augmentations that are a widespread commodity in the city. They need to be interesting, with enough room for people to create their own unique look and feel of a character, but standardized enough that it's possible to use stock stats throughout a larger setting. Moving away from combat slightly, I'd also like to implement a system of officers. To start with, our city wouldn't have any associations or officers, so it's important that the players are able to create their own and have the ability to have this interact with the wider city at large. Their actions should have some sort of resonance with what happens in the world, and at large enough levels perhaps even change the experience for other players. Another core part of the experience is travel, with the need to travel from place to place giving more weight to the situations happening in the city. As well as this, I'm reluctant to make this too close to Project Moon's established canon, so as to avoid having to spend hours poring over lore, so there won't be a W Corp here. As a result of this, we'll need to think of alternate forms of transport, with obviously walking as the one method that will always be available, but actual train networks could be a potential alternative. And, to tie everything together, we're going to need a system of money. Ideally, money should be sparse for the large majority of players, with officers having more money available to them due to pooling resources. As fixers advance, they should be able to take on more well-paying jobs, but that'll be balanced out by the increased cost of augmentations that come with that level of skill. First, we should decide on the system we're going to use for combat. The needs that need to be met are, as mentioned earlier, a fast-paced and enjoyable system that can be scaled up to larger groups of people to meet the minimum goal for player count I have. So, with this in mind, the first system I thought of was a mix of Dungeons & Dragons combat system and Ruiners. Attacks themselves would be decided with different die based on the value of the weapon, and defense could be handled with the classical DC rolls of D&D. As for the attacks each turn, these could be handled with the die system that Ruiner has, with speed rolls being rolled for a certain amount of die each turn that the weapons obtained would then be used as standards for combat pages. The advantage of a system like this is it's fun for all and gives equal opportunities no matter the level of character, although that may be a negative for reasons I'll go into later. Disadvantages of the system are fairly major though, with a long loop end up being repetitive and doesn't lend itself to being scaled up to far larger levels. So the next idea was to have combats aggregate the skills and values of the combatants before rolling a die at the start of the combat that would decide the entire thing. This immediately strips away all mechanical complexity, reducing the amount of time that each encounter needs to only the amount of time that would be taken to write a quick narrative summary. This is fast, easy to understand, and can be repeated a lot, a useful aspect for our future scaling goals, immediately placing it ahead of the first idea when it comes to versatility. But when it comes to being a main system of combat, it strips away much of the interesting part of fixers. As well as this, if overused, it may end up being boring and unfun, especially as a result of how luck-dependent one role can be. So, rather than having this as our main system, we can instead have an alternate version of combat that's used for all key engagements and duels between player characters. In this system, turns would consist of time between arbitrary units, with 100 arbitrary units being equivalent to one turn. Speed rolls would end up being the amount of arbitrary units until the character can next act, with more powerful characters obviously having less time before they can act again. Certain attacks could also integrate with this, either increasing or decreasing the amount of arbitrary speed units until the character can next act. There's one potential problem with this, and it's the fact that that means lower power characters may not even be able to act against stronger characters. But, now continuing the discussion from earlier, is that even an issue? To use an example of a duel between two characters, would you expect a normal grade 9 fixer to even be able to land a hit on the red mist in a duel? It makes sense for power to be shown clearly like this, and provides a reason to care about what attacks you're using and when. The one major negative is that it may potentially be confusing, although hopefully not be on the first or second fight using it. So, with our primary and secondary systems of combat decided, we can work on the next aspect of the game, being augmentations. Augmentations come in a few shapes and sizes, with the specific distinction of external and internal augmentations. External augmentations come in a few styles, with weapons, armor, and other apparel falling under that grouping. Internal augmentations are bionics and other hard-to-remove things, for example magical tattoos or organ replacements. Thinking about the system, it seems fitting to have two different routes that can be taken when it comes to securing augmentations, there being store-bought augmentations and player-built augmentations. This provides people who just want to fight a way to access gear for their level, but gives people who want to make artificer officers a way to do so. So, as a part of this, we're going to need to include the creation of weapons and armor and eventual skill system, as well as make the collection of resources an additional possibility rather than solely money. Some NPC augmentation cells would still exist in the city, meaning that in-house smiths aren't a necessary aspect for any officer to actually be able to fight and improve their power, but larger officers may want to take on a few skilled crafters, or even pass off this work to smaller specialized officers that can provide the resources to craft the weaponry they need. In the future of this, it's also likely that ego gear might be involved. However, I'd personally like to keep this for the future, saving it for already very powerful characters as a reward for a climactic moment. For the largest majority of people, it won't even be a consideration, remaining a rare reward for very few. With all this prior talk about officers, and with a focus on the fixer experience as a whole, it's important that we make a system that does this justice. There are no associations in the city to start with at least, so every office will be a standalone unit. Players will have the ability to create an office, either with only themselves or with other players. This is how jobs are gained, with each office beginning to develop a reputation based on the jobs they complete. Over time, NPCs may begin to approach officers to get specific jobs done based on their reputation, or even other players may ask for officers to deal with jobs for them. Physical premises will be needed for officers, requiring either money paid to the owner of the land, generally the corporation to which the local area belongs, or based on agreement with the owners of the land. For larger offices, this will naturally cost more, but will allow for other things to be built inside them, for example, a training centre or forge. With an idea of physical spaces for officers, and the idea that jobs don't exist in the void with no actual title land, we're going to need a system of transport for our game. Personally, I want to avoid all W Corp style just teleport to wherever you need to solutions, as I feel it cheapens the impact of space. A large monetary requirement to simply remove an aspect of the game entirely doesn't feel satisfying to me, which is why transport in the city, to start with, at least, will be limited to 3 modes of transport, that being walking, driving, or taking a train. Walking is rather obviously free, but when dealing with a city the size of an entire country, it's not exactly feasible to take contracts solely on the basis of moving around on foot. This is where driving, and the more expensive trains, come into play. These would cost more money and, in the case of driving, draw more attention to your fixes than simply walking would. However, these methods of transport are infinitely more time efficient, taking the time of the trip from the north of the city to the south from about a month to a day or two at most. And finally, we need to develop the resource system this game will be using, seeing as all the other aspects of this game exist to feed back into, or derive from, the accrual of resources. Obviously the main, and for the most part important, resource is money. A similar system to the pound or American dollar will suffice for this, singular units of currency that can be split up into 100 of a smaller unit of currency fitting nicely. Of course, money has no purpose without resources to back it, and this is where other resources come into play. To avoid too much complexity behind the system, there will be different types of resources that come in different rarities. Basic materials are the most common, followed by complex, and then finally specialized materials. The main methods of getting these resources will be taking on jobs and trading with the corporations through the use of money earned through taking on jobs. Although, for officers that specialise enough and had skilled enough crafters, it will be possible to convert some resource into others, providing another potential route that doesn't simply involve fighting to make a living. So, with all that talk through, I'd like to take you through what the player sheet and map has ended up looking like, and, after that, how you can get involved with this game as well. The first thing that you need to decide for your character is their name, followed quickly by a description, personality, and backstory. This game is separate to PM's already existing lore, so assume all corporations are different. There are no pre-existing officers or associations as well, so unless you're going to be creating an office that you refer to in your backstory, try to avoid mentioning those. The city is still a miserable place, just not the exact same misery as in any of the other games. After this is the base health and your speed, neither of which need to be changed. Your items equipped also don't need to be changed, so that'll be handled later. Your weapon of choice immediately after this determines what weapons you'll start with. You can pick 2 skill proficiencies, giving you an early boost of 20 to the skills you pick. Relationships is extra flavour to begin with, although it is relevant at a later date when you begin to meet other players and NPCs. Just fill it out with any family or friends your fixer has or may have had. And then finally there's the skill section. These affect the actions you can make in the game, making certain checks easier and improving the effects of others. Other than 2 skill proficiency you have to start, this will be handled at a later date as you begin to work on them in game. The map is still the same, with each district representing a tile in game. There's really not much to go over here, the rulebook goes over all relevant details for the map. So with that cleared up, how can you actually play this game? Well, it's rather simple. After the insane success of the last video, I decided to make a Discord server that's available to join right now, with the link in the description. There I'll be hosting this game, with applications opening soon after this video has come out. So if you're interested, go ahead and join. I'd be happy to have a place to talk more clearly with any fans, as well as being able to use it somewhere to clear up any important announcements or mistakes I've made in previous videos. So with that said, good morning, good evening, and good night. And thank you again for watching to the end of the video, it really does mean a lot.